everyone, this is John Daly. I'm here with my co-host Thomas D. House for another episode of the Reagan Caucus podcast. Our guest today is a man with a very long legal career who has spent many years defending people's First Amendment rights. He is Vice President for Legal Strategy at Stand Together and Senior Advisor at Americans for Prosperity. His work is dedicated to ensuring a constitutionally limited government that protects the civil liberties of all Americans. Talking about Casey Mattox. Casey, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. This is great.
Well, it's great having you on. Thank you. I'd like to start things off with a very broad question before bringing in Thomas for some more detailed ones. A couple weeks ago, when a federal court blocked President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, the White House's Stephen Miller tweeted that, I don't know, you probably saw this, Casey, that the judicial coup is out of control. And in response, Greg Nunziata from the Society for the Rule of Law tweeted what I thought was an interesting point. He said, "The judiciary is the most constitutionally functional branch of government. Congress is inert and the executive is wildly overreaching." Casey, at this point in U.S. history, isn't that observation that Greg made kind of inarguably true? It feels like the judicial branch is taking their constitutional role seriously in a way that the other two simply are not. Am I correct in that, or am I oversimplifying that?
Yeah, I think that's undeniably true. I mean, not to say that the judicial branch it gets everything right. I mean, I watch both as I think as the judicial branch itself overreaches and underreaches plenty of times. I mean, just very recently, the court has declined to take some cases that are just puzzling to me because you've got people's constitutional rights in limbo, and the court is just refusing to answer those questions. And they have a very small docket, right? There's plenty of things to criticize the court for. The non-enforcement of non-delegation and many of the other principles in the Constitution that frankly leave us in the position where the other branches are not doing their jobs. So there's plenty to criticize the courts for. At the same time, I think it is undeniably true, at least from my perspective, that Congress is not doing its job. Article 1 lays out the role of Congress, and if you read Article 1 and then look at the current Congress, these are not the same picture. It just does not work that way. And the presidency, likewise, is a completely different animal right now than the presidency. And I'm not speaking about Trump. I'm speaking about the presidents, frankly, for longer than my lifetime. The institution has been completely different than anything described in the Constitution. The courts, more or less, are by far the most functional branch. And I think that seems to be pretty clear.
Great. Well, yeah, that's something to think about. I'm going to go ahead and bring Thomas in for some questions. Go ahead, Thomas.
So about those, as the audience knows, there was, it was a international trade court was actually where it happened, that they ruled that that the Liberation Day tariffs were not authorized by the statute that the president's administration was claiming that authorized them. So that put a temporary pause on the tariffs before an appellate court, was it an appellate court, stepped in?
Yeah, it's the Court of International Trade, and there's an appeal from the Court of International Trade to the Court of Federal Claims. So that's basically where the case is pending now.
Okay, and while it's pending, they're allowing the tariffs to continue. But how long will that probably take?
Yeah, at least as of right now. I think the way the Court of Federal Claims described it was while they review the papers. And so, at any point they could unfreeze that. They could, but yes, that's as of right now at least. That's which isn't terribly shocking. I think one of the things that would be on the minds of judges is, well, look, if we haven't been able to fully digest this question and act on it. Do we really want tariffs going off on, off on, off on? And so we would rather sort of set a baseline, even if we think we may end up agreeing with the court later. Let's sort of stop everything. Let us assess the situation, because you don't want boats bringing things to the United States, and one day there are major tariffs and the next day there's not, and back and forth, right?
Mhm.
So boats waiting to try to time their entry into the port to avoid tariffs. So I think it makes some sense, but that's where it's pending right now, is Court of Federal Claims.
Okay, so they had some discretion whether they would, while they were processing it, whether they would leave the tariffs on or off, and they just opted to leave them on because that's what the default, because that's what they were on at the time.
Right.
Okay, so have you had a chance then? My understanding is Elias Soman, right, was involved in because I don't remember who had standing to sue in this case. It was a bunch of people, right? It was like states were involved, I believe, right?
Yeah, there are some cases involving states. I'm trying to remember actually the identity of their plaintiffs now. We've got toy makers, I believe,
Mhm.
were a piece of them. But yeah, so it's basically this Liberty Justice Center, which is a nonprofit civil liberties organization. Brought the Janus case, actually. Some people may recall that case. Based out in Illinois, but sort of a national organization. They, along with Ilya Soman, brought that case in the Court of International Trade. So there are maybe 6, I guess, of these cases that are pending right now,
Okay.
and that's one of the group of these cases that's currently pending.
Okay. And were you able to review the argument put forward by Elias Soman for this case?
Yeah, it's basically I think one of the things that people don't appreciate about this question, I think people sort of walk a lot of the debates you see online, right, around the tariff issue. You have people sort of assuming that that these tariffs are like other tariffs and other tariff cases that have been raised in the past. They're a little different. I mean, one of the questions in this case, Court of International Trade has exclusive jurisdiction over cases dealing with tariffs. One of the questions in this case is this even a case dealing with tariffs? Because the statute that's at issue, IEPA, which is an emergency, allows the president to declare an emergency and then has certain powers related to those. It doesn't mention tariffs, right? You can search in the statute, the word doesn't come up. Tariffs, duties, none of those words come up. No, the administration argues that nevertheless it gives them the power to impose tariffs, and that's basically the question. Is this bare question? Not does the president have tariff power? Are tariffs something that something that the president can have the power to create? It's basically, does this statute that he is relying upon give him this power and the breadth of power over tariffs that he's claiming? And basically, the argument from Soman and Liberty Justice Center and several of the other cases is that for several constitutional reasons, the president doesn't have this power. And that's basically that something called the Major Questions Doctrine, which the court has been developing for some time, was used to repeatedly strike down actions from the Biden administration, correctly in my view, over COVID and student loans and other issues where that administration was claiming that statutes that never said anything about forgiving student loans, for example, or imposing vaccine mandates on private businesses, that those statutes nevertheless gave the president that power. And so you had a president who was just sort of stretching the text of a statute. So the argument here from Liberty Justice Center and Soman is that similarly, this statute just does not say that the president has tariff power. And then relatedly, and even if it did, even if it was there's just this sort of unbounded authority that Congress had given the president to declare an emergency and then decide which countries to impose tariffs on, at what rates, on what products, just completely open-ended. that would violate something called the non-delegation doctrine, which is basically the idea that it's Congress's job to make laws, it's the president's job to enforce the laws, and at some level, when Congress if Congress can, or if Congress has handed power over to the president, at some point it's just said essentially, why don't you just decide what the laws should be and go forth and enforce those laws once you've made them? And that's not something that Congress can do. That's the argument under the non-delegation doctrine. So those are kind of the twin big constitutional theories that are involved here. Major questions and non-delegation. Major questions is kind of the smaller of the two in a sense, because it would basically say, look, we're not going to assume Congress has delegated something that is a really significant power that would radically transform the economy or have a significant impact. We're not going to assume that unless Congress has been clear. And so I think that's ultimately sort of the way these cases look right now, is that the administration has a difficult argument saying that Congress has clearly handed this power over to the president when the statute doesn't reference the tariff power at all.
So about the non-delegation doctrine, because I know that's a contentious matter among constitutional lawyers, but where, as far as the case law related to non-delegation, obviously Congress has delegated, been allowed by the Supreme Court to delegate quite a bit more than I think somebody who's a Federalist Society lawyer will probably be happy with, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, that's
but what are the principles that they use? Because it still does have some teeth in my understanding in the case law. So what are the principles that the court uses to allow, what kind of delegation that it will allow? Is it just that major questions thing? Is that basically the principle?
Yeah, so basically, the non-delegation doctrine kind of comes from the fact that Article 1 of the Constitution, right, creates Congress, says Congress is vested with all legislative power. And so the argument is, well, if Congress is vested with all legislative power, it can't just delegate that power to another branch, the same way that the court, frankly, could not just say to another branch, why don't you just decide, why don't we just defer to you the questions on interpreting the Constitution? And so that's basically where it comes from. The only cases that have actually held that something violated the non-delegation doctrine were from 1935. Two cases from 1935. The one that most people have heard about was this case called Schechter Poultry. Those are basically the cases. Since then, what the court has essentially done is to say, well, we're going to say that delegations are okay so long as Congress has created an intelligible principle that will guide the agencies in enforcing the law. In practice, what that has basically meant is that virtually, every delegation since 1935 that has reached the Supreme Court has been upheld. And so, I think it is rather toothless at this point. There is a lot of indication that we've seen where the court has shown an interest in trying to put some teeth back in to the non-delegation doctrine. They took a case called Gundy a few years ago, which was basically, one of the side questions in non-delegation is, well, what about criminal statutes, right? When Congress is, if Congress is delegating the power to an agency to decide, what are the criminal laws that you can actually be put in jail for a very long time for, shouldn't that at least be something that we're going to have some teeth there, that you can't have, unelected bureaucrats deciding to put people in jail for things that Congress has never actually said they should be put in jail for. And so that was the Gundy case. Court decided at 5-4, basically with Justice Alito saying, yeah, I want to make the non-delegation thing a thing, but not in this rather icky case dealing with sex trafficking, child predator situation. And so that was kind of the problem in Gundy. You have a case pending right now that's a related kind of question, or related in the sense that it's another big opportunity for the court to say, surely at least in the area of taxation, right? So you have criminal violations and taxes. Surely it can't be that Congress can delegate to bureaucrats the power to decide taxes. That was sort of the whole basis for, for the revolution, was no taxation without representation, right? I'm not represented by any bureaucrats anywhere in Washington, D.C. That are unelected. So we elect a Congress to decide how much am I going to be taxed and for what. And so there's a case called Consumers Research versus Federal Communications Commission. If you look on your phone bill, you'll see a universal service fee, and that's charged basically every month. You get this universal service fee that you pay. Congress has never voted on what the universal service fee should be. They delegated the power over to the FCC to decide what it should be. The FCC then said to the phone companies, why don't you help tell us what this fee should be, and we will charge everyone that fee, and then give most of that money to the phone companies to build infrastructure for phone lines. So that's another opportunity. So there's basically at least a couple of good opportunities, I think, for the court to try to start reining in this delegation of legislative power. And frankly, from my perspective, most of the challenges that we are dealing with basically begin with this problem, begin with the fact that Congress is taking power from the states, from localities, and then not even being responsible for the decisions that are being made, because then they then just hand that power over to the executive branch. So you have a double whammy there. Congress removing the power from the elected officials that are closest to us, where we could have some differences between people who live in New Jersey and Colorado and Virginia and around the country, taking that power away from them, but then not even being the ones who make the difficult decisions, instead just handing that over to bureaucrats. I think that's the worst case scenario, and I think delegation is basically the reason why many of these problems that we have.
So it seems like, obviously, it's a complex matter when you get to like the details of it. But if you take it to the extreme and you see that the idea of Congress, if there is no non-delegation doctrine that has any teeth, that would essentially allow Congress to destroy itself without any sort of constitutional amendment, because they would just hand everything over to the executive branch, and then we would have a country run by the exec. It would be some sort of neo-absolutist thing that we kind of have now with tariffs. But
I always feel like I think, frankly, everybody believes in the non-delegation doctrine on some level, because I think, yes, no one thinks that it would that this can possibly be real, that Congress literally could just decide we are authorizing the president to make the laws, right? That can't. No one believes that is. So basically, the question really is just: is that effectively what's happening? And when should the courts step in? What is the line? And I don't believe that anyone really thinks that if you had Congress and the Supreme Court could just basically enact a law, reach a decision where both of them said, we hereby authorize the president to do all of the things that we are constitutionally empowered to do. I don't think anyone really believes that. So it's just really a question of, well, what are the lines then?
Okay, so this being as the case that tariffs are a tax, and the way things are going with these tariffs are functionally allowing the president to tax us, increase our taxes as Americans. If that's the case, it seems like this tariff battle is a unique opportunity to give a little bit more teeth to the non-delegation doctrine if the court wants to,
Yeah, I think that's true. I think every non-delegation opportunity comes with a challenge, right? And so the challenge in these cases is this national security argument. The idea that the IEPA, this federal statute, allows the president a lot of power in a national emergency, and to declare an emergency, and then and so basically the question is, well, is that, one could imagine, right, a use of this power where you've got a specific country that is posing a threat in some way, and so the president responding to that with trade restrictions of some kind, where that all sort of makes sense. I think that the difficult thing for the administration here is that it's harder to buy the idea of a national emergency against the world, right? I mean, this imposes a 10% tariff on items coming from Liechtenstein, right? And so it becomes difficult to, I think there's a limit to the, to what makes sense as a national security threat. Difficulty there. I mean, I said at the outset that the courts, I think, are by far the most functioning branch. I think one place where the courts have sort of taken their hands off the wheel more than I would like is that they have really deferred to any question of national security and have authorized the executive branch to do a lot of things in the name of national security. Right, the TikTok case was a 9-0 decision from the Supreme Court, basically based on national security grounds. Right, so that's a very recent example of the court looking at that question and just deciding national security. That's as far as we really need to go here. That could absolutely play out in the tariff context. I think there's I would like to see the court be a bit more kind of curious about those questions. And I think even if you are particularly concerned about national security arguments have to themselves have some limits, right? It can't just be that you set aside textual constitutional requirements just because the words are claimed. There has to be some sort of look beneath the hood of some kind from the courts on claims of national security, or otherwise it just basically swallows the entire document.
So you're saying that do you think that the court potentially say the appellate courts reverse, and then the Supreme Court grants certiorari and they look at this case? I guess my gut inclines me to think that they would not let these tariffs go, but that, I'll put that aside. You say a potential thing that they could do is say that, listen, there might be some way in which they could justify tariffs, based on this statute, but it's just this interpretation of it is too broad and it's not plausible. If they were to focus on specifically China and say we're doing this because as a way to deter China from doing that, and you had some intelligible, connection between those two things, that would probably be a more plausible argument for the administration then.
Yeah, and frankly, I think the way that the administration wins this case at the Supreme Court, I don't know how it will go. If I had to bet, I think that the Court of International Trade decision will ultimately be at least largely upheld. But if it doesn't, the way that it would not, it would basically be the higher courts essentially saying this is a national security question, and so we are essentially taking the hands off of this and deferring to the president's judgment on whether whether this is a national emergency. That's sort of it's sort of akin to political question doctrine, where the courts just sort of voluntarily decide we're not weighing into this because it's a political question. The national security issues sort of have that same flavor to them, where courts just sort of don't want to wade into making decisions, which makes sense on some level, right? If you're actually arguing about things that would impact troops in the field and those kinds of questions, right? Some of the the immigration questions have even come up. I think that the administration has, some in some of the cases have decent arguments for we've got to make some decisions, and courts should not be ordering planes to turn around or whatever. Right? There are questions there that are at least sensible claims around national security questions. I think it's harder to make that argument in the context of tariffs that would affect the entire globe on basically every product all over the planet. That's a much harder argument for national security.
Yeah, it seems like if they gave if they extended that sort of deference to this case, future administrations could probably come up with all sorts of creative arguments for why everything they want to do is some national security thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically climate emergencies, racial justice emergencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can go through the list of things that progressives have wanted. I mean, there's student loan emergencies, right? A student debt emergency sort of argument. I mean, there's plenty of terrible ideas that would give just an immense amount of power to a president to claim that authority and act accordingly. So I think it potentially creates a worrying precedent. How the courts are going to deal with that, because I think they're not unaware of where these arguments would go. So even if they think that this is something they don't want to weigh in on, I think they have to be aware of the fact that if you sort of cede this power to the president for the same reason that I think one would have hoped we didn't really see this in the past administration, but the justices that are more generally on the left, some of the claims that were being made by Biden were essentially claims of power that would have completely authorized many of the things that they would now oppose from the current executive. And so, I think you got to sort of look a little further down the road. If we're going to maintain a constitutional republic, it's going to be messy. You're not going to get everything you want all the time. You're going to have to make some compromises to get the things that you really, really want, and give up on some other things for the things that other people really want. But the positive side is that it hopefully limits the other side's ability to just unilaterally do things that would be very bad for all of us.
John, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to actually ask some non-tariff questions,
Sure.
Casey. I think one of the things, just personally speaking, I think one of the best things Trump did during his first time in office was nominating Federalist Society judges to the Supreme Court. He ended up with a surprising 3 vacancies in a single term, and in the view of many conservatives, he made the best of it. A key advisor to those picks was Leonard Leo, co-founder of the Federalist Society, who Trump has recently started attacking. I believe he called him a sleazebag. He said that he was given bad advice on numerous judicial nominations. Aside from the fact that the ruling Trump was upset about on that particular day had nothing to do with any Federalist Society judges, those judges have, ruled against Trump a number of times, like when Trump has overstepped his executive authority. Do you worry about what Trump may do to the judiciary in the second term without people like Leonard Leo advising him?
I think it's such a confusing mess of a debate, because I think most people are most of the people you see discussing this question online are completely unaware of the fact that Leonard Leo has not been at FedSoc for some years. He's not been in that role, and so one, two, as a member of FedSoc, someone very engaged with FedSoc, we don't have big meetings where we vote on slates of judges. This is not a thing. And I think a lot of people are confused, or well, they are definitely very confused to read the the debates online around this. I think the reality is that FedSoc is a large and diverse organization. You've got people that I agree with more and people that I disagree with very often in FedSoc. It's conservatives, it's libertarians, and frankly, it's people of all different flavors of conservative libertarian legal movement are in FedSoc. Most of the people would be some of the folks on the more MAGA side would be excited about Trump appointing, probably have a long list of panels that they have been on at FedSoc and moderated at FedSoc. That's just reality. And so, I think there's a lot of confusion around this. What exactly is FedSoc? What does it do? I think the reality is that most of the judicial appointments that Trump is going to make are probably people who were in their FedSoc student chapters at the very least, and probably spent most of their career very engaged with FedSoc. So the idea that there is just a completely separate group of lawyers out there who would be qualified to be federal judges and are completely detached from FedSoc it's just not reality. I think we would benefit from a much more fact-based, clear understanding of what exactly is this organization. Frankly, it's a lot more nerdy and a lot more boring than most people think. This is a universe of people who get really excited about the questions that we were discussing at the beginning of this conversation, about non-delegation and major questions. If you were bored by that conversation, you would absolutely be bored by any FedSoc conference, because that's actually what happens, not a whole deliberation around a slate of judges. That's not a thing.
Yeah, you brought up TikTok earlier, so I wanted to ask you a little more about that. President Trump is reportedly using, I say reportedly, I think it's been leaked out of the White House. I'm not really sure, but has been using TikTok as some sort of negotiating chip in tariff talks with China. Even though I think, and I'm a little confused on this myself, I think TikTok is not even supposed to be operating right now in the United States because of a law Congress passed. And I believe is being ignored by Trump. But we don't need to get too far into the weeds, Casey, but can you, in broad terms, sort of explain what's going on here with TikTok, why it's still operating? Should it still be operating within the United States? Can you fill in the blanks a little bit?
Well, I can try. I mean, this is all the conversation we were having earlier about the importance of separation of powers. And I mean, here, all the complaints about Congress isn't doing their job. They're not actually legislating. Well, here Congress finally actually did its job. It legislated. They reached a consensus, and a whole lot of people were, there are a lot of opinions around TikTok and sort of the conservative libertarian world, frankly, on all sides of that question. Congress passed the law, and we're left now with a law that says that China must divest of TikTok, or TikTok has to be removed from, or can't operate in the United States. And the only exception was the president could create this short extension of that if there was basically an effort to try to, progress was being made on a deal, right? So if you've got China has, offered to sell TikTok and they've reached an agreement, but the closing date is 30 days later, then the president can extend that deadline. That has not happened. Instead, what we've had is just sort of extensions. So you have a law that's been passed by Congress that the president is just saying, well, we're just not going to follow it for right now. So I think we'll see this. I think June 19th, if I'm not mistaken. I think sometime next couple of weeks is the sort of next deadline from the extension, and it appears that the president, according to reports at least, plans to extend again. I think this is a screaming example of we need our government to work properly. Whether I like the TikTok law or don't like the TikTok law, if Congress passes a law, then we need to expect that it's actually enforced the way it's written. That might cause us to want a different law or to want Congress to act again to fix that. But that's what needs to happen. And right now it's just, Congress basically finally did something. And then even in the aftermath of that, you're left with the same problem of the executive branch is doing what it's going to do, and Congress is sort of sitting on the sidelines watching as a law that it's passed is ignored. That's not good for constitutional government.
Yeah. So I guess one of the purposes of this podcast is the main purpose is educational. So I mean, it's clear to me that we're not a very literate country as far as our own Constitution right now. And the Constitution is 7 articles, and it's not very long. Everybody could read it in a day. Not very long. It doesn't take very long to read it.
Right.
I'd encourage everybody who's listening to just read the Constitution again, even if you've already read it before. It has 7 articles, and the first 3 articles deal with the 3 branches of the federal government. So you mentioned the first article, which deals with Congress, and seeing as the federal government got it, it has a theory of delegated powers, that it's limited powers, unlike normal government that can deal with all these different issues. The federal government, which was bringing together all these different states, had certain powers that were delegated to it, and they start through Congress. And I believe it's Section 8 of Article 1 lists those powers that Congress has to make laws about. Before they even decided to have a Bill of Rights, that was the main limitation on the federal government, was that they were limited to those powers. The second article deals with the executive branch. I want to say something about, what does the Constitution say? What is the authority that the president has according to Article 2 of the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically Article 2, the same way that Article 1 vests all the legislative power in Congress. Article 2 vests all executive power in one president of the United States, is the way it's framed. Now that's where the unitary executive theory, often described, comes from, right? The idea that while we have all of these agencies all over the federal government that are executive branch agencies, all of their power comes just from the president. That the executive power is his and his alone. And I think that's correct. I think that ultimately, when we're talking about questions like the president's ability to hire and fire people, to move people out of the executive branch, I think it has to be true that the president has that kind of power. Now, that's a very, very good argument in my mind for enforcing all the other parts of the Constitution, because I think it has to be true that the president has an immense amount of power over the executive branch to decide how the laws are going to be administered, what they're going to prioritize, all of those questions and who is going to do them on his behalf, right? For non-confirmed positions, when you're if he is the one with the executive power. But that's a very good argument for making sure that, well, we should not be putting all of this power into the hands of an executive if the executive is going to be one person who has that kind of power. That's a good argument for non-delegation. It's a good argument for the courts to do their job and to make sure that all the other boundaries in the Constitution are respected. But it's the executive power, and a lot of the debates we then have are around, well, what exactly is this executive power? It should be power to enforce the laws that Congress has written.
Yeah. Well, it says right at the end of Article 2, it includes the oath of office. And it says, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, defend the Constitution. Okay. So, so the idea of the constitutional theory of the executive is that they're not an absolutist monarch or even an elected monarch, right? Their job is to faithfully execute the laws. So, in this case, with the TikTok ban, it sounds like the president's not faithfully executing the laws. What's the in the checks and balances that we have? What's the recourse? What recourse do we have to a president that doesn't faithfully execute the laws?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question is Congress. What is Congress's response to this, right? Congress, I mean, it's almost always the answer, in my view, that the first answer should be, well, what is Congress doing? Too often we ask the courts, so what are you going to do about this? Who has standing to challenge it? All those questions. Questions should be, Congress, you just recently passed this law. If you don't like this, and we assume that you don't because this is literally what you wrote, then you should take some sort of action here, right?
But what would be the actions that Congress could take if you have a president who's not executing the laws?
Yeah, so I mean, if Congress disagrees with the actions being taken, the president is relying upon the provision in the bill that says this allows for this 90-day extension, right? So you could repeal the 90-day extension. They could set a new deadline that says that repeals that extension, creates a deadline of whatever date without any opportunity for further extensions. They could do something like that if they wanted to. One of the things that Congress has often done is to basically defund different agencies. It has the power over purse strings, right? So Congress could decide, well, we're going to defund X, Y, and Z, or forbid the use of federal dollars for anything that would act in a way that we don't want the executive branch to act, right? So I think there are tools at Congress's disposal. There are also political realities there, and I think that's sort of what we're seeing play out. And I think a lot of people are sort of waiting for, well, what exactly is going to happen with this? Is this going to be an extension throughout the 4 years of his presidency? I'll say too that one of the political weirdnesses in this is you have a lot of libertarians who were opposed to the TikTok ban, opposed to this bill, and so you have them, and then basically that creates this weird dynamic where the president is actually creating the policy result that they favored, not following this law that they thought was wrong. And so, from my perspective, you have this sort of strange dynamic where a lot of the libertarians that you might expect to be the most vocal opponents of the extension are probably a little quieter about that because of the fact that they think that it's actually the right policy result.
And that's dangerous once you start giving up on the concern for the policy or the process.
Yeah, no, I think that's why you look at this law, and it's whatever you think about the law, we really need some clarity about if the president is using this lever of power. I think we need a lot more clarity about about this extension. What's the basis for it? Does that basis comply with the law itself? Congress could certainly do some oversight work there. I mentioned that the courts. It is going to be difficult, I think, for the courts to weigh in here because it's difficult coming up with the people who would have standing to raise this question. Social media companies, competitor social media companies might. You can imagine why that might be an awkward thing for a Twitter or a Facebook or Instagram, I guess, or someone to come in to go to court and say, hey, you passed a law banning that app.
Our competitor.
And so we have standing because
it affects us.
Like that's an awkward, I think it's probably reality. I think most of the other social media companies are looking at this thinking, so when are we going to get our competitor off the field here? but you
I'm
don't
sure
want to be part of that
Facebook
lab.
Reels. Facebook was probably the biggest one because they have that Reels thing, I think, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Um, so so that's one possibility. You have some state laws that have had previously taken action against TikTok in Montana and some other states. I think Montana, the chief among them. It seems to me that Montanans, or at least lawmakers in Montana, probably or might have some interest here in that's kind of different from the general population, where their law was sort of put on hold because this federal law supposedly preempted their law.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's going to preempt it and yet not actually be in effect, if you're Montana, it's like, well, then just let us enforce our law if you're not going to enforce the federal law. So, that might be a possibility as well. Um, but I think that to me, this is all just a screaming example that this is not the only circumstance where our sort of what you learned in Schoolhouse Rock is not playing out the way it was supposed to play out.
Yeah.
And we should demand better generally. Someone here needs to step in and say, we're going to follow a constitutional process. Either we're going to change the law, or we're going to enforce the law. But we're not going to just sort of have this dynamic where neither is true.
Well, you talked, Casey, about this, that you brought up Schoolhouse Rock, and was something else I've been wondering about too. I know former Republican Senator Ben Sass makes the point a lot of times that we don't really teach civics in school anymore the way we used to. Obviously, there was Saturday morning education, Schoolhouse Rock. Do you see that as? I noticed there was we care about these issues that we've been talking about, overreach of the executive branch, underreach of the legislative branch in some cases. Do you feel like this is not sufficiently taught today? There seems to be a lot of public disinterest in issues like this. Is that because, do you think, we don't place this emphasis in our education on items like this?
Yeah, I think most of what we end up seeing in civics education in schools, intentionally or not, what it effectively tells people is these are the levers of power that you can pull to make your policy preferences into a thing, and that sort of message then I think actually ends up undermining the whole point of civics education, which should be that if you've got a local problem, civics isn't just about how does the government operate. You certainly need to know that. You need to know how this is supposed to work. But then you need to also be connected to the gap between where we are and how it's supposed to work. So I think sort of maybe what we need is kind of practical civics. Like, look, these are the three branches of government, and this is how things are supposed to operate. And then in practice, this is what's actually occurring. And many of or a lot of the sense of unease that I think a lot of people have with the way that the way the government operates isn't because of the separation of powers, isn't because of federalism. It's because we're not doing separation of powers and we're not doing federalism. And I think that's the point that people need to be well connected to with civics. The other thing I think that I think people need to be connected to, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, was that civics is about isn't just about government. It's about the sort of de Tocquevillian sense of community responsibility, engagement with your community. I think if we, the hope in the long term isn't just that people would understand well how the Constitution is supposed to work, but that you would have students coming out of school connected to the idea that if I have a problem that I see in my community, my first response ought to be, how can I work with other people to solve that problem in my community? If there's a broken swing on the playground at my kid's school, who can I talk to about getting together on Saturday, going to Home Depot and fixing the swing, as opposed to what's my congressman's number? We need an appropriation to fix the swing. I think the more we can, think in terms of kind of local civics, working to solve problems at the local level. I think that's what's really sort of missing, as opposed to this is the text of the document picture that just sort of leaves you feeling like, well, if that's what the Constitution says, and I look around at what's happening in the world and see that things aren't good, then all of that must be a terrible idea. And James Madison was wrong. As opposed to, no, he was right. We have just spent 250 years attempting to avoid doing what the document says. And that's why things aren't working well.
I mean, I would say it's worked extraordinarily well. It's just not meeting the as well as it could be if we had a little bit more buy-in. How did you get interested in my last question for you is, how did you get interested in American constitutionalism? Because one thing I've been seeing the last few years, it seemed to me like 10, 15, 20 years ago, at least conservative pundits and the conservative ecosystem was very much supportive of American constitutionalism in its checks and balances and separation. Maybe it's because Obama's in power or something. I don't know. But they appreciated it. They realized they didn't want some sort of absolutist monarch, system. Even if it was an elected monarch, they would always say, we have a republic, not a democracy, which I think it's both. It's a democratic republic, but what they're getting at there is it's not just like a stone throw democracy. That there is a system of law there, that we have a constitution, and the Constitution. What does James Madison say? It allows us to sort of mitigate passion and allow the reason of the public to rule, by allowing protection of minorities during in the short term as we work things out. What was that expression you used about passion and reason? I was do you remember this? Yeah,
I'm forgetting the quote. But
yeah, but the idea is if you just have a simple simple majority democracy that decides everything, then you're going to have a lot of chaos, and a lot of violations of rights of the democratic minority. Our system of government with federalism and the three branches of government with the separation of power and checks and balances. Adrian Vermeule, in some of his books, Adrian Vermeule is a Schmittian. He teaches at Harvard. He likes Carl Schmitt, and he wants a more absolutist, elected absolutist rule of the executive branch. He says that America's been great despite our Constitution, right? He thinks that the checks and balances and the separation of powers didn't really do anything. They just hindered a more effective government. Well, you obviously disagree with that. You're somebody who believes in American constitutionalism. Do you want to would you like to kind of make your case then for American constitutionalism against all this trend of like, let's just elect a president who does whatever we want?
Yeah, I think the beginning of your question, and I'll answer both. The beginning of your question, how did I get engaged here? Because I think it feeds into the end answer as well. It's basically that I spent most of my career as a First Amendment litigator, defending First Amendment rights of students, faculty, religious organizations. I was at Christian Legal Society, Alliance Defending Freedom, religious liberty organizations for basically most of my career before I moved over to what was then the Koch Institute and now and AFP and now Stand Together. And basically the reason I'm so passionate about separation of powers and federalism is because I think that those First Amendment rights, particularly religious liberty and free speech, are so absolutely fundamental to human dignity and protecting human dignity. And at the end of the day, you can't fully protect those in any sort of absolutist government power scenario. Every dictatorship over the course of human history has proven that to us, right? And the First Amendment, I think Madison viewed the First Amendment as unnecessary because he saw Article 1, Section 8 as, well, these are the things that Congress has the power to do. We didn't put regulate religion, regulate speech in there, therefore it can't. I think the others at the time who were opposed to the Constitution rightly understood that that's great and that's true, but I think we should be a bit more express about what powers that the government doesn't have, and so they advocated for the Bill of Rights. But that doesn't change the fact that the Bill of Rights is not the primary protector of your First Amendment rights. I think Justice Scalia made the point that every tin-pot dictatorship has a Bill of Rights of some kind. The Soviet Union had a Bill of Rights. What makes America unique is the fact that we have separated powers. And so, not to get theological, but basically, I mean, my view, kind of the end of your question, I think that, my view is basically that fundamentally, man is fallen, sin is a thing. Governments are created are created to help us deal with the reality of that, right? Either from external threats or from internal, people taking your property, people violating your rights, people killing you. All of those things are basically a result of the fall. That's why we create governments, to deal with the fact that the fall happened. The problem is that governments themselves are occupied by fallen people, and so government is only an effective response to the fall if you then also limit government. Otherwise, it becomes an incredibly dangerous agent of the same sort of sinful desires that people have. So that's kind of my operational mindset, and I think that's fundamentally why I do not understand and completely disagree with the approach of those, usually coming from, I think often well-meaning, Catholic or fellow believer perspectives who want to advocate for government authority over these questions. I think it's inconsistent with an understanding of the fallenness of man to put that kind of power into the hands of man. It's not going to lead to anything good. It's not going to lead to anything perfect, right? Separation of powers, all those things. You're still going to have sinful people doing sinful things. I just want that power to be diffused as much as possible, so that when sinful people predictably do sinful things, it has as little impact as possible. And so that's kind of my operational mindset, and it's why I think the sort of consolidation of power is fundamentally sort of at odds with a Christian or Judeo-Christian worldview.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Casey. That's probably a great place for us to end this episode on. That was a very good explanation, a very admirable one. I want to thank you for coming on to the Reagan Caucus podcast. I think listeners came away with a lot of great information from this episode, and we'd love to have you on again sometime in the future.
Fantastic. This has been great. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks. Sure. Thank you so much, Casey. I think I enjoyed this. This was wonderful, and like John, I say that last thing you said was perfect. You gave us your own version of Federalist 51 there, and it was perfect. I loved it.
Super. Fantastic. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. And for everybody watching or listening today, if you watched on YouTube, as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or some other audio platform, make sure you like and subscribe. And we will see you all next time on the Reagan Caucus podcast.